Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, Chapter 7, Halacha 1. This is part 2 of the Shir, and if you're following along the art scroll, we're on page 52b4. So, yesterday we were covering the Mishnah, and the Gemara starts off and it tries to figure out how do we know in the Torah that dyeing, things for dyeing, things used to make colors into fabrics and things like that, that this is going to be subject to Sheviis sanctity. Where do you know this from? So the Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to refer back to Leviticus 25:6, which is also where we know about for food for humans and animals. And it's going to say in that verse in the Torah, the Shabbos of the land shall be for you to eat, and for your animal, all its crop shall be to eat. This is going to be the source of the law for things with dyeing. Now that's not really very clear or obvious. And they want to understand where do you know this from? How are you deriving this? The Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say that let us derive from the following verse that the Shabbos produce of the land shall be for you to eat. And this for you, this is implying that you can use it for any purpose that is necessary for you. And any kind of necessary for you, and you being plural, okay? You being in general. So it's going to limit it to a sick person for medicine, because that would say that, well, that's not really for you. That's really just for this person. Or it'll say that somebody who has a sickness, that they've lost their sense of taste, and there's a type of produce that's very strong that can help if somebody doesn't have any taste. Well, that's going to be limited because that's just going to be for that person. Okay, so the for you has to be understood as general. It's a plural for you, meaning all of you, right? And in the American South, they have a plural you, which is you all, but that doesn't really exist in proper English. But that's really what this is saying over here. This is a plural you. This is saying you, plural. So all of you have to be able to do it, not just a sick person. That would be too narrow. Now, we're going to get into the rest of the Gemara today, and it's going to cover more about dyes. It's going to cover about other uses that we haven't really talked about yet. So what happens if you're taking something from Sheviis and you're going to try to make perfume out of it? What's going to be the status of it? What about if you're taking dyes and you're going to make it into dye that's going to be used for animals? Why do you make animal dye? Because you mark your animals. You want to know which one you're going to slaughter and not. So if you make dyes that you're going to use just to mark the sheep to know which one goes to the slaughterhouse and which one doesn't, is that going to have Sheviis sanctity? And what if that's on the wool? What if you've marked the wool and it's on the wool? Does that wool now have Sheviis sanctity on it because it was made with a dye that's used for animals, not for people, but for animals, and that now is marked on the animal's fur? Is that going to be something that has a problem? We're going to come into other issues. What about if you have fragrant spices? What if you're having cinnamon grow and for some reason it has Sheviis sanctity, and you or some other kind of fragrant herb that you can preserve? Sometimes people will preserve rosemary, and is that, you're only using it for fragrance, you're not using it for cooking. What about that? Is that going to have Sheviis sanctity? So we're covering that today. Now, Rabbi Yonah is going to continue about the medical plaster. Okay? And Rabbi Yonah asks, and he says that the Brisa stated, excluded is using Sheviis produce to make a medical plaster. And we can infer from this that regarding a plant species that stands to be used for making plasters, that it does not have Sheviis sanctity. So, again, what this last Brisa is trying to teach is a general for you, and it has to be a common generality. In other words, it's for all of you, not just limited to this sick person. And because it's going to be limited just to a sick person for like picking these herbs for a medicinal use, that this is not going to have Sheviis sanctity. And that's because sick people need it. And if you have a plant that's only for a few people or a select group of people, it's not going to have Sheviis sanctity. Rabbi Yonah comes and is going to ask a question about this. Gemara reads, but contrast this with that which is taught in the following brisa. This is going to be in Tosefta 5:4. And it says regarding Dan, Tzad, and Isatis seed that are sown in Sheviis, Sheviis sanctity takes effect on them. So these species are used to make perfumes, and they're only used by the wealthy. Only rich people can afford this. And therefore, since it's not useful to all people, why would it be that Sheviis sanctity is going to take effect on them? We have another question. What about things that are going to limit a specific group just based on economics? So this brings up a question. What about saffron? If you have saffron is the most expensive spice in the world. Pound for pound, it costs more than gold. And back then, only the rich could eat it. And same today, only the rich can use it for food. So because only a rich portion of the population can afford it, is that also going to have Sheviis sanctity? Because it's really not for you. It's really just for this specific select group of people. Well, this is talking about something that's even more abstract than that. This is saying, no, these species are actually just used for perfumes, and these perfumes are only for rich people. So what about that? Now, I want to look at the Vilna Goan about this. The Vilna Goan is saying that these are inedible products that are soaked in oil to create fragrant perfumes. And when he looks at this phrase, he's understanding this phrase that are sown, when it says Dan, Tzad, and Isatis seed that are sown in Sheviis. When he's saying that are sown, it doesn't mean, according to the Vilna Gaon's reading, that it is put into the ground. Rather, he's saying that these are plants that are actually soaked into oil. And there's some idea by the Vilna Gaon, although the Isatis is going to be woad. We covered that yesterday. But Dan and Sad is unknown. And the Vilna Gaon is going to read it as roses and reeds. But again, it's still technically unknown exactly what is Sad and what is Dan. So the Gemara is going to respond to this question about these perfumes that are now made with this Sheviis product, and it's only for the rich people. Gemara responds and says, what relevance does that brisa have here to the issue of plants used for medicinal plasters? And plant species used for plasters are excluded from Sheviis sanctity because of the term for you in the plural form. And that's going to basically include products fit for use that is equal to all. And the idea is that in a case where you have medical plasters, that's only for this select group of sick people. And the products that we're talking about later, where it's in that Tosefta, it's talking about these perfumes, that's going to be fit for use for all. And in other words, since all people can get benefit out of the perfume, whether you can afford it or not, thereby it's not really limited. That's really what it's saying. Yes, only the wealthy can afford them, but basically as a quality of this product, it could be useful for anybody. And that's going to be why this is going to have Sheviis sanctity, and it would take effect on these plants. This, by the way, is a logic for why saffron would also be having Sheviis sanctity. So the idea here is that when we're talking about a select group of people, we're saying that only this group is going to have benefit from it and no one else. Not because of economics, only because of the fitness of the product and the person. And so if you gave one of these medicinal plasters to a regular person, it would do nothing. And the problem with doing nothing is now you are wasting. You are wasting Sheviis produce. So when it's talking about for you in the text, it's talking about this generality of for you plural. And it means that intrinsically, it has to be able to benefit everybody. So even if you can't afford it, the basic product would still be nice to have. So that's going to be what's going to determine whether it's going to have Sheviis sanctity. Now we're going to move on to getting back to dyes. And we're going to get back to this original question about the source for dyes having Sheviis sanctity. Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Rabbi Law that you may derive this law from the following source. It was taught in a Baraisa. This, by the way, is going to be in Torah's Kohanim, Bahar 110. And it says, the phrase, all its crop shall be to eat. This, by the way, is going to be in Leviticus 25:7. This is going to be extra, and that is coming to teach. So that's coming to teach that Sheviis produce may be used even for kindling a lamp or for dyeing. So let's read the whole verse, and we'll see how this is an extra verse. So again, the idea here from Torah's Kohanim that this is saying is the phrase, all its crop shall be to eat, is extra. And that's trying to teach something. So the entire phrase, this is Leviticus 25:6-7, says, the Shabbos produce of the land shall be for you to eat, for you, for your slave, for your maidservant, for your laborer, and for your resident who dwells with you, and for your animal, and for the beast that is in your land. All its crop shall be to eat. The idea is that this extra verse at the end, all its crop shall be to eat, is extra. And since the Torah could have included the animal and the beast in the first verse, and then the slave, the maidservant, laborer, and resident, and say, it shall be, permitted to, for others to use the Sheviis produce, and it doesn't really phrase it that way. What it's saying is that the Sheviis crop, in addition to being used as food for humans, animals, as stated explicitly, and then shall also be available for other uses. And that is going to be the idea on why it's going to have a broader specification. And you can see more about that from the Malbim's commentary in Leviticus. So the idea here is that because of this extra phrase at the end of the sentence, this extra, all its crop shall be to eat, it's coming to teach that Sheviis produce may be used even for kindling a lamp or for dyeing. Now, what type of Sheviis produce are we dealing with here? And if the produce that is used as food for people, how could it be used for dyeing? So the Gemara is going to ask, and it's going to say, by utilizing this manner, does it not emerge that one is destroying human food of Sheviis, which is forbidden? So that if you're saying that if you're taking human food and then you're going to use it for non-food purpose, like dyeing cloth, that's going to be wasteful. That's going to basically be destroying it. So that's not really going to be the assumption, because you're not allowed to waste it. So, and we know that destruction of Sheviis produce is also going to be forbidden. So what this verse is trying to teach, this extra concluding verse, where it's saying all its crop shall be to eat, this is really trying to say that this is not talking about produce that's food for you to eat that could be wasted and turned into dye. This is talking about other types of products that can't be eaten that can be turned into dye. For instance, the rinds of pomegranates. We covered this yesterday. Or the hulls, the shell, not the shells, but the hulls inside, the husks inside for the walnut. These are used for dyes. So it's not really edible, but you could you could get use out of it, and it's going to have Sheviis sanctity, and that's going to be the idea. So we're trying to make a fine point here where we're saying that these other things can be used, and it doesn't mean or necessitate that you're destroying food, and that you can have the food and still get dyes without destroying anything. So it's also interesting that it's broadening it out to say, no. These other herbs that you're not using for food, or these parts of the plants that you're not using for food, you can use it for these other uses like dyes, and it's still going to have the sanctity. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, you must interpret the verse as referring to inedible plant species that are used to produce dyes for humans, and this is teaching that these may be used for dyeing in Sheviis, since the verse needs to permit the use of inedible dyes in Sheviis. We learned that they have Sheviis sanctity. So one of the things that this verse is trying to do is it's trying to show, this verse in Leviticus, that non-edible produce that has use in human civilization, like dyeing, that this is also going to have Sheviis sanctity. Now, the Vilna Goan is going to comment on this, and he's going to say that if they did not have Sheviis sanctity, there would be no need to teach that they can be used for dyeing. And the Chazan Ish says about this in his 1321, his commentary over in Beur. He's saying that if dyes did not have Sheviis sanctity, they would be permitted for any use, and then there would be no reason to have any restriction. And so if the verse had not alluded to dyes at all, they would surely be permitted for dyeing along with any use. And by including a reference to dyes in the Sheviis passage, the Torah is teaching that they also have Sheviis sanctity, and it informs us that they may be used only for dyeing or similar purposes that are compatible with Sheviis sanctity, and they may not be disposed of or thrown away wastefully, and you can't use them for business. You can't use them for commerce. And so the Chazan Ish is saying that the Torah is actually stating the permit of dyeing in order to allude that the other uses are also restricted. So, part of the idea is a way of trying to look at this verse and see that there could be other uses. But the Gemara doesn't like this inference. And Rabbi Manna is going to say, interpret the verse as dealing with animal food, which can have Sheviis sanctity, and it's teaching that these may be used to produce dyes for humans. And so that what this is saying is that you cannot derive anything from the verse with respect to the Sheviis sanctity of totally inedible plants for dyes. In other words, says Rosh Hashanah, to explain this, that since the verse can be understood to mean that animal food may be used as dyeing, it does not really refer to inedible plants that can be used for dyeing. And it does not provide a basis for the rule that dyes are going to have Sheviis sanctity. Rather, we would derive the Mishnah's rule from the first scriptural source that's going to be cited right in the beginning of this Gemara, where it's going to talk about for you. It's not going to say that, it's not going to look at, there's two scriptural analysis going on here. The first is going to be, which is the start of the Gemara, and it's what we talked about yesterday. It's going to be Leviticus 25, 6, and 7. They both are. And the idea is they're looking at different parts of the sentence. Okay? So in the beginning where it says, the Sabbath of the land shall be for you to eat. So this original derivation is saying that the for you to eat is really talking about you plural. And it's saying that this Shabbos produce can be used for any purpose that is a necessity for you. In other words, any normal human necessity. So that would be like eating, drinking, anointing, dyeing. So it would say like, hey, perhaps you have a food crop that can only be turned into a drink. Are you going to be able to do that? Are you going to, let's say you have oranges, but you don't want to, squeeze you don't want to eat your oranges, you want to squeeze them into juice, and then you have the juice. Is that going to have Sheviis sanctity? So that's really going to be saying that any common human use, like eating and drinking, or taking something and anointing on you, rubbing olive oil on you, that's very good for your skin, and it gets absorbed into your skin. And what about dyeing? That's, people dye their clothes all the time because it's a basic human necessity to have, clean clothes, nice clothes, clothes that, look a certain way, perhaps to fit into the society. But what's going to be excluded is going to be medicinal plasters. Why? Because this is talking about only a class of people, the sick people, and these medicinal plasters don't have a general use for everybody. And if you put it onto a normal, healthy person, it wouldn't do anything. You'd be wasting. And that's why this is not going to have Sheviis sanctity for medical plaster. So they're deriving it from the very first part of this verse. Rabbi Yonah is deriving this from the very end of the verse. And they're basically saying, Rabbi Yosei is deriving from the end of the verse. And he's saying that at the end of the verse, this phrase of all its crop shall be to eat, this is extra. And what this is trying to show is that this is going to be including non-edible plants. So Rabbi Manna doesn't like that, and he says that no, actually, we're talking about plants that can be used as animal food, and that this is going to be what could be used for dyes. It's not talking about it's not talking about inedible plants. It's talking about plants that have to at least have the status where animals would eat it for food. And if that's the case, then that's what you can use to make your dyes. And they're deriving it from the first part of the verse, not this extra and all its crop shall be to eat. So the idea is that when you simply read the verse, it would indicate that it deals with animal foods, and the phrase shall be appears in the middle of the clause referring to the consumption of animals and beasts. So the Malbim in his commentary points out that Rabbi Manna's rebuttal fits well with the plain meaning of the verse, and the Malbim has a commentary on how this verse in the middle will fit together with animal dyes. So the Chazan Ish is saying that this Gemara, that human foods of Sheviis may not be used for the purpose of dyeing, even for humans. And the Chazan Ish is saying that this Yerushalmi is explicitly permitting human food for dyeing. The one before is permitting human food for dyeing, and that's going to contradict what we're seeing over here, that human food cannot be used for dyeing, because the idea is that you'd be taking human food and wasting it. And so there's some difficulties on how to explain this Gemara and the other Gemaras, and how to reconcile it, because you have a case here with, what do you do with human foods? Could it be turned into dyes or not? And, if you're turning it into a dye, is that going to be considered wasteful? What about these inedible plants? And Rabbi Manna's reading of this is saying that no, the only plants that have any kind of sanctity at all are going to be something that's at least suitable for animal food. That's what's going to be used for dyes, not something that has an inedible use. It has to be at least edible, because the verse is talking about for you to eat or the animal to eat. And that's what Rabbi Manna is trying to get at. So the Gemara is going to make the next logical step, and it's going to ask a question which seems very logical. It says, okay, regarding dyes used for animals. So this is going to be a plant species that is going to be used for dyeing an animal instead of clothing or utensil. It's going to be an inferior type of pigment, And why would you be marking animals? Well, you're going to mark the animals for slaughter. You're going to want to know this one, I know that these ones are this age, and I'm going to paint something green on it. Okay. And I know that these green sheep, come, the third month of the year, I'm going to take them out for slaughter. And I'm not going to get confused between, a second-year sheep and a third-year sheep. Okay. So there is a use, and they still mark animals even to this day. The question now is, well, what if you're going to take these inferior pigments and you're going to make dyes, and it's only going to be used for animal? What's going to be the law if these dyes are going to have Sheviis sanctity? And the Gemara is going to resolve it. It's going to say, let us learn the law from the following. Baraisa says the root of the rose, the root of ege, the root of sumac, all of which are used to produce dyes for animals, do not have Sheviis sanctity, and that dye stuff for animals have no Sheviis sanctity. So the idea here, these plants, sumac, by the way, is a type of tree. It has a red fruit, and they use this red fruit for human food and salads as a spice. But let's say you're only taking this and using it for, animal dye. The idea is that if, in the case that you were growing this root of sumac, the fruit is used for humans, but the dye, the fruit is used for humans. The root of this sumac, the Gemara is saying the root, and the root has no edible people use. So if you were to take out the root of the sumac, and it will have this light reddish inferior pigment, you wouldn't want to use it for clothes. There are better things to use for clothes, but nonetheless, you could take this and mark an animal with it. So the idea is that this is not going to have Sheviis sanctity. Now, there's going to be another question. So again, basically, if you're taking these inferior plants or parts of the plant and you're taking it and turning it into a dye used for animals, it's not going to have Sheviis sanctity. What's interesting is on the sumac tree, the sumac is going to have two parts of the plant. Again, we're talking about two parts. The fruit, that's going to have Sheviis sanctity, and that is used to make a spice that's used in salads, especially in the Middle East. They still do it today. And then you have the root, and the root is going to be used for dyes commonly, but an inferior type of animal dye. And this is not going to have Sheviis sanctity, although the fruit of the tree would have Sheviis sanctity. So another question regarding a plant species that's used for laundry. So there are many, many different types of chemicals that have been used over the years to make a type of detergent that could be used for laundry. And what about if you have a species of plant that you could use to make a type of detergent? Is that going to have Sheviis sanctity? And so the Gemara says, what is the law as to whether these will have Sheviis sanctity? And it's going to get answered. It's going to say, let us learn the law from the following brisa. Yarnin, boris, and aloe, all of which are going to be used as detergents, have Sheviis sanctity. So we can see that species that are going to be used for laundering are going to have a Sheviis sanctity. Now, there's a Gemara elsewhere in the Shas that says that that laundry is a necessity, and that if you don't have clean laundry, that eventually over time you'll go mad and you'll become crazy and deranged. And so this is like a pekuach nefesh thing. So it becomes a necessity to have clean clothes. And the question is, these types of plants, the yarnin, the boris, and the aloe, which are used as detergents, is this going to have Sheviis produce because it's used for this necessity? In this case, it's going to be for laundering. And it would seem, according to this, that plants used specifically for Sheviis are going to have Sheviis sanctity, but there's a dispute on this. So you should make a mental note that there's another Yerushalmi that's going to be elsewhere that's going to say that laundry agents are not subject to Sheviis. So the question is which is which and how to reconcile it. I think the best thing to do is just to take a look at the Rambam and see, because there's a malachit between two Yerushalmis on it. But this particular one is saying that it does have Sheviis sanctity, and that species used for laundering will have Sheviis sanctity. Now, there's another question. What about fragrant spices that are inedible? What is the law as to whether these will have Sheviis sanctity? In other words, that spices that could be used to flavor foods, well, this is definitely going to have Sheviis sanctity, but this is not talking about this. This is talking about a type of plant that's only used for the fragrance, like potpourri, and you don't eat it, and it can't be eaten. So if you want to make some nice plant arrangement that smells nice and make some potpourri and have a nice smelling room, is that going to have Sheviis sanctity? That's really going to be the question. So again, if you took some rosemary, and even if you had the intention only to smell it, you would say that yes, it still has Sheviis sanctity because it could be eaten, and it could be eaten by anybody. But in terms of another type of potpourri, a lot of times these are woody spices that really can't be used for food at all, and probably wouldn't taste very good, but they smell nice. So the Gemara is going to try to resolve this, and it's going to say, let us learn the law from the following brisa. The white flower and the oren. The oren is going to be the white flower as lirosis in Spanish, or a white lily, which are enjoyed for the fragrance, do not have Sheviis sanctity. So the idea here is that if you have this, and it's only used for the fragrance, it does not have Sheviis sanctity. Now, there's a brisa in Tosefta 5:4 that talks about these species, and it also says that they do not have Beur. So I want to point out that the Tosefta is not contradicting this at all. If something does not have Beur, it doesn't have Beur, and it doesn't have Sheviis sanctity. So that's going to be the idea. Now, we were talking about types of plants that can be always in the field, like the leek, the bulb of the leek, and that will not be subject to Beur, but it will have Sheviis sanctity. So that should make a note of that. So, and that's, by the way, in this Mishnah. So the Gemara is going to continue, and this actually is going to get rejected. And the scholars said that the brisa is reflective of the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, but it is disputed by the rabbis. And Rabbi Shimon said in the Mishnah below, balsam does not have Sheviis sanctity because it is not a fruit. Well, that's very interesting, because balsam is one of the spices for the, it's a fragrant resin. They cut a tree, and it makes a sap, and it's a type of tree resin. And, some say that this could refer to any kind of tree resin, not just balsam, but this is used for the ketoret. This is used for the incense. So the question is, hey, is the incense going to have Sheviis sanctity? What about that? You might have spices in there that, could be eaten and not just smelled. And the question is that, if you're making a compound out of it, is that going to have Sheviis sanctity? And, or is it going to be a case where, the need to do the ketoret in the temple is going to override the law of Sheviis here. So there's a rule that, if you have a taseh and you have a low taseh, the taseh will always overrule the low taseh. And so the ketoret is a thing that's supposed to be brought every day. And so over there with the Sheviis sanctity, you would say that that's this is where it has to be just for this period of time, that parts of it will have a lo ta'aseh because part of it has to be put out. So Rabbi Shimon is saying that balsam does not have Sheviis sanctity because it is not a fruit, but the rabbis are ruling in this Mishnah that balsam does have Sheviis sanctity. So according to Rabbi Shimon, the white flower and oren also do not have Sheviis sanctity, and that opinion is reflected in the Brisa. Oh, so here's the ta'aseh and lo ta'aseh, right? So you have a lo ta'aseh of you shall not destroy Sheviis produce because it has sanctity. But you have a ta'aseh, which is that you're supposed to burn the ketoret. You're supposed to burn the incense, and especially in the temple. So this is going to... And by the way, the other thing about it is that it can only be compounded and used in the temple. So that's a case where it would override it. So if it's going to be like what the rabbis are saying, that balsam is going to have Sheviis sanctity and the balsam is used in the ketoret, that this is going to be an issue that's going to come up. So the rabbis are suggesting that it's possible that the white flower, this lily, is going to have Sheviis sanctity, and this is really, what the issue is going to be. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is saying that, well, balsam is a sap and it doesn't have Sheviis sanctity because it's not a fruit. And he's saying that it's an edible and it does not provide any physical benefit that would classify it as a type of plant that would subject it to Sheviis sanctity. So, balsam is just used for the fragrance. So Rabbi Shimon's holding that a fragrance is not a benefit that causes Sheviis sanctity to take effect on a plant. But the rabbis don't agree with that. The rabbis are disputing Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah, in another Mishnah, and ruling that balsam, in fact, does have Sheviis sanctity. And so the idea here is that, fragrance is not a cause for Sheviis sanctity to take effect, but the question is whether a fragrant plant would have Sheviis sanctity is going to be, relevant according to the rabbis. Now, the rabbis are ruling that balsam does have Sheviis sanctity, but it does not prove that, in their opinion, a fragrant plant like this white lily should also have Sheviis sanctity. So, why are the rabbis reasoning that that this could be used, that this would have it, right? So the rabbis are still probably saying that if you have something that's just going to be used only for fragrance and it can't be eaten, then they're going to agree with Rabbi Shimon that it's not used and it's not going to have sanctity. So why are the rabbis saying that the balsam is going to be used? And they're saying that perhaps that this tree resin could be used to curdle cheese, and that comes up in Orla 1:7, or it could be used to make a perfumed oil. And they're going to say that if you have a perfumed oil, this is going to be a physical benefit. But it's not known whether the rabbis are saying that fragrant plants should have Sheviis sanctity, or that balsam is considered like a fruit, and whether a fragrant plant would also have Sheviis sanctity. So it's unclear exactly the nature of why the rabbis are saying that no, balsam is different. Now there's going to be another resolution on this. Rabbi Shmuel says in the name of Rabbi Abahu, you can interpret the Brisa as being in accordance with all opinions, as we are dealing with a sliver of wood itself. In other words, the wood, which is going to be the stem of the white flower of this white lily, is not fragrant. And the rabbis who are disputing Rabbi Shimon are going to agree that it's not going to have Sheviis sanctity. Again, we are dividing plants up into parts. And the idea is that you could read it where, according to Marafulda, the Brisa that's excluding the white flower and the oren from Sheviis sanctity might be talking about the wood part, and that would even follow the opinion of the rabbis. And because the wood is not fragrant at all, it's going to be extra, and it's not going to have Sheviis sanctity. And that's going to be the question: is if you have just the plant and the flower, and that part is just going to have the fragrance. So the question is going to be, is that part going to have Sheviis sanctity, but the wood part is not going to have Sheviis sanctity? So the question as to whether a fragrant spice that can't be used as food and is going to be just the part that is fragrant, not the part that's not fragrant, not like the wood, right? In the case of this lily, the wood is not fragrant, but the lily part, the flower part, is. And actually, this ends up where if you have this kind of thing, like the lily, that the flower is fragrant but has no other use other than just to be fragrant, whether this is going to have Sheviis sanctity or not, it's unresolved. And this actually has a lot of ramifications in Halacha, because you have a lot of flowers that have no benefit other than the smell. And the question is, you might have flowers that are just for decoration. That's going to be clear that it has no Sheviis sanctity, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about flowers that just are used for the smell. And that's really what's unresolved. We don't know. So it's going to be another question. What do you have to say regarding plant species that are used only to produce fuel for kindling lamps, such as the desert gourd and the calyx of the rose? So these are going to be seeds of the desert, and this seeds of the desert gourd, and they're going to be pressed into oil. And this oil is going to be used to light lamps. And the other reference to this is going to be the rose hips. Yes, roses do have hips. And this is right underneath the flower petals, and that's where the seeds are. And these seeds are going to be pressed into oil and used for lamps. So this is going to be talking about the rose hip. And sometimes you see multivitamins with rose hips in them. So they do produce something that makes light with light. They make this oil, and the question is this going to have Sheviis sanctity? And the Gemara is going to resolve this. The Brisa teaches three things regarding three components of the rose. Again, we're dividing up the plant into multiple parts. The first rule is its petals, and they have Sheviis sanctity, and the money exchanged for them has Sheviis sanctity, and they are subject to Beur, and the money exchanged to them is subject to Beur. So again, we're dividing up the rose, and the petals, they have Sheviis sanctity, is subject to Beur, and if you did business with it, that money is also subject to Beur. In other words, that if you exchange something for these petals, and these roses these rose petals had Sheviis sanctity, you actually have to take the money out once it reaches the time of Beur and leave it out to be destroyed. Has Sheviis sanctity. The second rule is going to be these rose hips where all the seeds are. This is going to be a different part of the plant. And the idea is that, says this Gemara, it has Sheviis sanctity and the money exchanged for it has Sheviis sanctity, but it is not subject to Beur, and the money exchanged for it is not subject to Beur. The idea is that these rose hips have Sheviis sanctity because it can be used to produce oil, and that could be used to kindle, but it's not going to be subject to Beur. Why? Because these rose hips will survive the winter. In other words, they'll always be there. And the petals might fall off when it gets cold, but the hips themselves stay. And that is why the hips itself will still have Sheviis sanctity, but if you exchange money for it, it doesn't have Beur because it's still in the field. Then the third rule, now we're talking about the next part of the plant, we're talking about its root, and it has no Sheviis sanctity, nor does the money exchanged for it have Sheviis sanctity, and it is not subject to Beur, nor is the money exchanged for it subject to Beur. And since the Brisa rules that the calyx of the rose has Sheviis sanctity, we see that even plant products that are used exclusively for oil, for kindling, can have Sheviis sanctity. So the root of the rose can only be used to produce dye for animals, as we were talking about. And it says specifically that it does not have Sheviis sanctity, but it's also not eaten. the root of the rose is not eaten, and since Beur can only apply to something that potentially has Sheviis, the root is not going to be subject to Beur because the root doesn't have Sheviis sanctity. Only something that has Sheviis sanctity can be subject to Beur. Now, there are some things that will stay in the field over the winter and still be available. Those have Sheviis sanctity. Those are not subject to Beur. But something that is never subject to Sheviis is never subject to this question of whether it's going to have Beur or not. It can't have Beur. So now we're going to talk about the rose, and we're going to talk more about it, about the next function, which is more obvious to us. Rabbi Yerushalmi asks before Rabbi Abahu, what is the law as to whether it is permitted to soak rose petals in oil in order to create a fragrant perfume? And we know that rose petals can be used to season food, and the idea here is that we're trying to soak the petals in oil to make it into a perfume. Now, the question is going to be, well, if you're taking these rose petals, which could be used for food, and now you're putting it into the oil to make it into a fragrance, is that going to be a destruction and a waste of Sheviis produce? And is that going to be allowed? Or is it going to be permitted? Because, you would say that perfume is going to be a legitimate use of the rose. So that's really what the question's trying to get at. Rabbi Abahu answers, and Rabbi Abahu replies and says, does the rose have any other function? Since that is the primary use of rose petals, which is to make it into perfume, it is permitted. Now there's another opinion. Rabbi Chia taught in a Brisa, a rose is considered human food, and therefore soaking it in oil to make perfume is going to be a waste, and it's going to be prohibited. And the Gemara is going to rule on the matter, distinguishing between different species of roses. So Rabbi Mana rules making perfume with orustin is permitted, and making it with aduro dustan is permitted, and making it with kitratan is permitted, and making it with mira sintan is permitted, and making it with darminion is permitted. And however, making perfume with idromiron is prohibited, and making it with deomiron is prohibited. So this is trying to talk about different varieties of roses, and some are going to be only raised for perfume, and some will only be raised for human food. And so if you're taking a rose that's only used for perfume, that's not going to be a wasteful use of it. And if you were taking one that was raised for food and then turned it into perfume, that will be a wasted thing. So there's no disagreement between what Rabbi Abahu's teaching and what Rabbi Chia is teaching. They're just talking about different things, and Rabbi Mana clarifies it for us that there are two different kinds of roses that are grown. Now, the Mishnah was talking about animal food that will have Sheviis sanctity, and it will also be subject to Beur. One of these are going to be thorns and thistles. Goats will eat that stuff. Now, there's a question on thorns and thistles. So the Siporians, these are going to be in the north, they're going to ask Rabbi Imi, and they're going to say, what is the law with respect to moistening wheat with them? In other words, you have thorns and thistles of Sheviis, is this going to be permitted or not? So the question here, says the Vilna Goan, is they're asking, is it permitted to take thorns and thistles that are wet with dew and place them on wheat in order to moisten and soften the wheat? And that's really going to be the question. So thorns and thistles that would be used for moistening wheat or hands are going to be rendered inedible for the animals. And the Gemara is going to ask whether the usage is going to be considered wasteful, and or is it going to be considered where it would be permitted to use animal food to help out a human need, such as a therapeutic plaster, and moistening wheat with getting wheat to be moist is going to be a human need, because you could turn it into a plaster. So the Gemara is looking at the possibility that moistening with animal fodder might be a deviation from the use of the fodder, and that might get around this, wasting issue. So in other words, making therapeutic plasters, says the Chazan Ish, is not a deviation because it is a common secondary use for animal fodder. So this is an interesting question. This is trying to say that if you're taking the animal fodder, it does have Sheviis, but now you're using the animal fodder to improve something for a human use, and now this animal fodder can't be used as animal fodder anymore, but now you're having something of a human use that you wouldn't have had before. Is that really going to be allowed? In other words, it's a back of the hand way to dispose of the animal fodder, but improve the human thing. And you're getting an improved human product that you wouldn't have had before, but you're getting rid of animal fodder that you did have before. Is that going to be considered wasting? And Rabbi Imi resolves the question. He says to them, the students came and said in the name of Rabbi Hanina that even leaves of karsaya are permitted to be used for moistening wheat, and certainly then thorns and thistles can be used for this purpose. In other words, the leaves of the karsaya, they're more edible by an animal than like thorns, right? Who can eat thorns? Just goats. It's just goats eat that stuff. But karsaya is probably better for every kind of animal. And so what they're saying is that we're seeing that if you're taking this better plant that could be used for moistening, it's basically not going to be considered a deviated use, and therefore it's going to be considered permitted. And the idea is that if you could use it for something that's considered better for animals than thorns, then surely the thorns will be allowed. So the idea here is can you take something that degrades the animal food, but meanwhile enhances something for human use? And the idea is yes, you can. But the worry is that, well, wait a second, but you're not allowed to destroy. And then you'd say, well, it seems that over here that you've created something new for humans, and that is going to justify it. And then you would also say that this is not a normal way to use animal food, and because it's not a normal way to use animal food, it's a back of the hand way to do it, and it's not like a direct destruction, so to speak. So this ruling gets confirmed. Rabbi Yoshaya says Rabbi Hanina stated that this is a halacha to be followed in actual practice, and you can rely on it. So there's going to be a related ruling by Rabbi Hoshaya. Rabbi Yoshaya says you do not have any plant that is designated exclusively for animals other than grass alone. So grass and nothing else is basically going to be considered fodder. And there's going to be a Tehillim, which is going to state that, says Rosh Shirilio. It's going to be Tehillim 104:14. It's going to say he makes grass sprout for the animals. And so basically Rabbi Yeshaya is saying that really just grass is going to be for animals. And ordinarily, if you had wet grass of Sheviis, you would not be allowed to moisten wheat with it. That's going to be the idea. So because grass and nothing else is going to be considered animal fodder, the idea is that if you were taking something else that were less desirable than grass, then since grass is the optimal thing to eat, you would not be able to do this with grass, but everything else you would be able to. The Chazan Ish says that the rule that grass has Sheviis sanctity relates only to places where animals actually graze on it, and where it does not stand to be eaten, it is not treated as fodder, and therefore will have no Sheviis sanctity. So ordinarily, wet grass of Sheviis can't be used to go moisten the wheat. And the Gemara says, but nevertheless, if one took grass from the ground with the intent to moisten it, he is permitted to moisten it. So the idea is that although grass is naturally designated just for animal fodder, the Rosh Hashanah says that, about this, that if you picked it from the ground with the intent to use it for moistening it, his intention declassifies it as inherent animal food and allows it to be used for moistening. So it's going to be taught in a Baraisa that regarding grasses and all other greens that one took from the ground with the intent to moisten them, it is permitted to moisten with them. But if he intended to use them for animal food, it is forbidden to moisten with them. Now there's going to be an opposing opinion, and Bar Kappa taught in a Baraisa, it is permitted to moisten wheat with grass and other greens, and even if they were picked with the intent to use as animal food. So Bar Kappa is saying that even grass that was picked for animal food may nonetheless be used for moistening, and just as animal food with Sheviis sanctity can be used to make plasters and other human needs, he's rejecting the argument that moistening is considered a deviation, and that's going to be for, fodder. So the Bryce is going to continue, and the Bryce is going to say, but is it forbidden to squeeze juice from them? In other words, can you take the wheat grass or the grass and try to juice it? People do make wheat grass and actually make a juice out of it. And they say, and they do it today. So they say, is it forbidden to squeeze juice from them? And, there are other types of grasses that do have a juice that could be used as a therapeutic use. And, the question is, with regards to what Bar Kappa is saying, is that, moist grasses that are fit for animals, can also be used to moisten the wheat, but they can't be squeezed for their juice. And the Gemara says, but it is forbidden to squeeze juice from them. And why is it forbidden? Because they have Sheviis sanctity, and destroying them by squeezing their juice is incompatible with this sanctity. In other words, that you still have this inedible part that's left, and you've taken out all the goodness, and you've effectively destroyed it. That's what he's saying. The Gemara is going to ask, and it's going to say, but do animal foods in general not have Sheviis sanctity? Yet you say in the Mishnah, this is going to be in chapter 8.1, that we may make them into medicinal plasters for humans, since it is permitted to reassign animal food to a therapeutic human use. Let us also permit the squeezing of the juice from the grasses for a therapeutic human use. And the Gemara is going to answer. Rabbi Yossi says that, granted, we've learned in the Mishnah in 8.1 that we may make animal foods of Sheviis into plasters for humans. In other words, we can upgrade them. But we have not learned that it is permitted to squeeze them and make their juices into medicines for humans. So when it's talking about turning the animal food to be made into a plaster to put onto the outside, it's going to still have Sheviis sanctity in a new form, and the plaster is essentially going to be a processed version of the original animal food. And the issue is going to be whether the product is going to be medicinally consistent with its sanctity. Now, when we were talking about this earlier in the shiur, we were talking about what about the potential of turning human food into a medicinal plaster? And we would say, no, you can't do that because you have this narrow group, and you're saying that this medicinal plaster has to be available where all people could use it, and you're effectively wasting the food. So now it's saying, well, wait a second, but if you're taking a medicinal plaster and it's being made out of the animal food, that is going to be considered to be okay. But only for the plaster, and they're not going to allow you to squeeze these grasses to make it to use for like a therapeutic drink that humans can do. You can just leave it at the plaster. They're not going to let you. They're going to let you transform it for a medicinal use, but they're not going to let you do it for a liquid form, and the juice is going to be considered to be different. Now, the Vilna Goan is going to say about this that since squeezing fruit is going to destroy the Sheviis sanctified product, this is also going to be disallowed. So the question is, would you be able to take fruit and then just squeeze it and turn it into a liquid form, and then you have the rest of the fruit left sort of squeezed out? Is that going to be allowed? And the Vilna Goan is saying no, that you've effectively destroyed the Sheviis sanctified product, and it's not allowed. So have a great day, and we will continue tomorrow.